Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's virtual roundtable on environmental and energy factors for a sustainable cannabis industry. I'm going to note at the top of this that this session is being recorded and open to the press. We ask that if you have questions, we have asked for them ahead of time. We have a few in the queue, but if you have any further questions, you can put them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom functionality at the bottom of this. Please do not use the chat function, but the Q&A function. My name is Andrew Friedman, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, or as we affectionately call it, CPEAR, where our tagline is "Cannabis reform is here, and we exist to get it right." And in that vein, CPEAR is proud to partner with the Resource Innovation Institute to host today's virtual roundtable discussion. Today, over 40% of Americans have access to regulated adult use cannabis, and all but 3 states have legalized some form of cannabis. Although this state cannabis legalization is already underway, a federal framework to regulate the cannabis marketplace is absent. This includes creating a regulatory structure that is sustainable and environmentally preferable. Today's roundtable will focus on factors for a green cannabis policy that address environmental concerns and sustainability measures through development and innovation. I'd like now to welcome my friend Derek Smith, Executive Director of the Resource Innovation Institute and a member of our Center of Excellence. Pleasure to have you, Derek.
Thank you, Andrew. It is an honor to serve on CPEAR's Center of Excellence. I'm going to tell you all briefly about me and then my organization. I've had a 20-year career in sustainability in the public, private, and nonprofit spaces, including having the opportunity to testify in front of the U.S. Senate Energy Committee. I helped found Resource Innovation Institute as a nonprofit in 2016 to advance energy and water efficiency in what was then the emerging cannabis cultivation market. Our founding team had experience at all levels of government, as well as at the U.S. Green Building Council. And we recognized that there would be an absence of key federal agencies like the U.S. Department of Energy. And so that would create a vacuum for things like data on energy usage, policy guidance to states, support for utility and energy efficiency program development, and most importantly, help for producers on how to improve the efficiency of their operations. And so RII stepped in to fill those roles. Today, 5 years later, we've built the largest data set on cannabis energy and water usage called PowerScore. And we have the privilege of working with subject matter experts who serve on our technical advisory council to help us develop peer-reviewed best practices guidance so that cultivators know how best to integrate efficient practices into their operations. We're also working outside of cannabis on a 3-year grant funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to drive efficiency throughout other sectors of indoor agriculture. And that grant is funding the development of an indoor agriculture green building rating system to enable leading producers to earn recognition for their leadership on these issues. So just in terms of framing today's conversation, this is really important and timely. We truly have the opportunity to set the framework for moving forward on actualizing a more sustainable cannabis industry. Thank you.
It's not a Zoom call unless somebody talks on mute at least once, right? Thanks, Derek. I'd like now to introduce our panel of industry experts who will be with us for this conversation around a sustainable cannabis framework. Our first panelist is Jennifer Amon, who currently serves as Building Program Director for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. In her role at ACEEE, she promotes residential and commercial whole building performance improvements, explores behavioral approaches to improving energy efficiency, and analyzes the impact of stronger appliance efficiency standards. We're glad to have you, Jennifer. Thank you for being with us. Our next panelist is Jesse Horton. Jesse is the Chief Executive Officer of Loud, that's LOWD, an award-winning cannabis company that embodies the art of urban craft cultivation. Jesse founded Loud after experiencing successes in medical cannabis cultivation. Jesse then co-founded the Minority Cannabis Business Association, MCBA, the first and largest nonprofit organization developed to create equal access and economic empowerment for cannabis businesses, their patients, and their communities. Thank you for joining us, Jesse. And then finally, we have Brian Harrington, who serves as Vice President of External Affairs for the Hawthorne Gardening Company. the leading supplier of indoor cultivation products. In his role, Brian leads policy development for the state, federal, and international government affairs program. He also manages the Hawthorne Justice Program, our Hawthorne Social Justice Fund, which is focused on addressing the problems caused by the disproportionate number of cannabis-related arrests and incarcerations involving persons of color, job creation, entrepreneurship, and increased investment opportunities in minority communities. And little known fact, which I just learned a while ago, is that he is the mayor of Flower Hill, Long Island. And as a former public servant myself, I can only tip my hat to those who decide to volunteer their time in public service, and good on you. We're also looking forward to your thoughts today, Brian. So to set this up as kind of a theme, my bio very quickly is I was a lawyer in then Governor Higgins' cabinet, mainly working on early childhood education issues when the governor legalized cannabis and called me in and said, "You're now cannabis czar." Which meant that I had to oversee programs related to adult use medical hemp regulations. And I'm going to start with just a little bit of a mea culpa, because I remember sitting there in this kind of scratched together office, wondering how we were ever going to get all of these different parts of the regulatory system up and coming when I was directly approached on making sure that we would have an environmentally sustainable system before we ever got up and running. And I told them point blank that I thought that was a second year, third year, or fifth year problem and not a first year problem. And that was clearly wrong on my side. And there was clearly more work that could have been done, and that Colorado has made strides recently to achieve, but would have been a better situation had I come in early and provided some actual executive leadership there. So this is my attempt to make up for past sins, is inviting people who are far smarter on the issue than myself to talk about what we need to do starting right now, or probably yesterday or 5 years ago, to create the federal framework necessary to really be a leader in sustainability. So I'm very excited to hear from your lessons learned, and maybe we'll start with Derek talking through kind of what we have learned from our state-by-state approaches.
Yeah, and Colorado has done great work since you've left. A few states have taken action on these issues, energy and environmental issues, most notably Massachusetts and California and Colorado. In general, what the states are trying to do is cap energy use by placing requirements on lighting systems, because that sort of starts the cascade of energy use throughout a facility. They're doing a lot more than that, and in some cases they're providing support systems for producers to actually help them move toward efficiency. Several states are requiring producers to report their energy and water usage, which is really helpful because there is otherwise not much data to guide effective decision making. And speaking of data, I wanted to share some of our findings to date from the data that we've aggregated. First of all, energy usage is all over the map. Every cultivation operation is different. Some are craft production centers like Jesse's. Others are massive multi-state operations. Some produce in warehouses, some produce in greenhouses. As I've toured facilities all over the country, I've seen the equivalent of an illicit market basement essentially blown up to 50,000 square feet with hot lights over the canopy, portable dehumidifiers, and power cords kind of strung throughout. I've also seen state-of-the-art automated facilities with LED lighting and large solar arrays on the roof. And I would say that latter example is trending more toward standard practice. And what you'll hear as a policymaker is that a lot of folks will conflate the illicit market facilities with what's actually going on today in a much more dynamic, regulated market with a lot of efficiency improvements. So the second point I want to make is that it's inaccurate to make a blanket statement that one form of cultivation is more environmentally preferable than another. You can imagine that an outdoor farm in Arizona has a very different environmental profile than an indoor facility in Michigan. We really need to study how the methods of production, uses of technologies, sources of energy, climate zones, how all of these things are impacting energy and water usage. The third thing I want to point out this is good news, is that efficient technologies are proving to work. And as one example, our findings reveal that facilities using LED lighting in the flowering stage show 34% less electricity use per square foot of canopy and 80% greater electricity productivity, meaning they're producing nearly double the amount of cannabis flower per unit of electricity consumed. And the final point is also good news. Overall, the industry is getting more efficient. As Politico recently reported, the industry's average use of electricity at a facility level has improved 20% from 2018 to 2020. And I see no reason why that's not going to continue as new technologies and practices get adopted. So we've given this a lot of thought at Resource Innovation Institute, and I just want to break out to kind of tee up the panel. Some policy recommendations in bite-sized chunks. Our recommended role for the federal government is to learn from the states, study their approaches, assess the results they're getting. For example, there's 1 year now of Massachusetts data. Number 2, or B, recognize the need for data-driven decision-making. By far, the number one thing that everybody in the supply chain agrees that is going to help advance efficiency and the understanding of what is driving efficiency is more data. And the third thing is to focus on carrots, not sticks, to complement state actions by doing things like supporting a voluntary certification system like LEED, but one that is relevant to buildings with plants, not buildings with humans. Also encouraging utility incentives, even when energy codes are put into place. And advancing racial justice by supporting financing and technical assistance for undercapitalized entrepreneurs. So as we look to the day forward, when the state walls come down, I believe we will look back then to see that those jurisdictions who invested in the efficiency of their producers will be the ones that will most likely have ongoing tax proceeds flowing to their local communities. Resource efficiency is truly defining the future of cannabis. I'm thrilled to have RII board members Jesse and Jen here and Brian from Hawthorne for this dialogue. So let's kick it off.
Great. So to kick that off, taking a couple steps back, like almost all issues that cannabis deals with, there's kind of always huge different sides of the story. The sky is falling versus things look actually generally pretty good, or even that we found a new utopia. So my question for all the panelists really is, do we have a problem here? And even if we don't, are there things we can do now to make significant progress to make the cannabis industry a leader in sustainability?
Hey, Andrew, I'll jump in here. So first, thank you to RII, Derek and the team there, and Andrew from CPEAR for inviting us to be a part of this and putting this discussion together. I think that's a great question. I think, as you're saying, in so many things in the cannabis industry, I think we have more of a perception problem and a data problem, first and foremost. To the point that Derek just made, cannabis production has been around for decades. We're not starting from zero. Previously, it was done in very inefficient, illicit operations. And with the states that have legalized and regulated, progress has been made just on that alone. I think the perception is kind of fueled by, some of the recent media coverage and it really highlights the data problem that Derek referred to. And if we're going to continue to rely on, the inaccurate and really lack of data that's out there, I think we're going to struggle to properly explain to the public what's happening out there, explain to policymakers, and have a real robust dialogue about how to move the industry forward. But we also have to educate people about all the strides that have been made today. You go back to HPS lighting, it was single-ended, it was double-ended. That helped improve efficiency. With the advent of LED technology and growing, that is helping. Now we got to get people educated on how to use it, how that changes all the systems in their grows. And that will help increase adoption, where we think it may be about 10% today in the marketplace. We think that can increase over time. So I think really the problem is not a, hey, is the industry getting better? It definitely is. If you're in the industry, you see the technologies that are being adopted. The feedback is that it is. I think it's translating that into actually showing people that it is through better, robust data mechanisms, and then correcting the misinformation that's out there.
Other thoughts on this?
Sure, Andrew, I'll jump in. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. I think one of the other, just to build on Brian's comments, the industry has also really been challenged because if you look at innovation in other sectors of the economy, there's so much work that the government can do to support innovation, to support activities to improve resource efficiency because of all the social goods that delivers. And we don't see that here. So despite all the innovation we have seen in the industry, just think where we could be if we'd had the national labs working on technologies for the sector like they do for the building sector. If we'd had the resources of USDA working with growers to help them, advance new technologies and new production processes like other farmers benefit from, we could be so much further ahead than we are. So I think it's really, kudos to the innovation and the dedication of folks in the industry that have really pushed forward, whether it's the growers themselves or the companies that supply them with equipment and materials. Moving forward, not only unleashing the resources, the expertise, and the skill of these federal agencies, but also academia and others that haven't been able to participate in research around this area, around this crop because of their limitations under the current regulatory environment. I think, even more evidence to back up, what Derek has said, that resource efficiency is really critical, but also, really the driving force in the industry now.
Great comments. Jesse, I saw you were trying to get off mute before.
Yeah, I think if I could layer anything on top of this, it would just be the perspective that the adoption rate for most cultivators of new technology and new processes is very slow because of the nature of cannabis cultivation, and that, some operators are getting 6 harvests a year, even if they're indoors, some more. When you change something with so many different variables, it could really be a lot to understand what's happening there. And without, it kind of lends way more to the data that is needed out there. And the more peer groups, the more data. And I think also a realistic visual of the opportunity to differentiate that is out there, if we can more so incentivize cultivators and educate consumers on the importance of these things, and how a watt per, or how many watts per gram matters to those cultivators when they're making those choices. So I think with a lot of the new technology that's coming in, that's great. And LEDs have been out there for a long time, but people have still been very, very slow to adapt or to accept that technology because of the fact that we need more data, more peer groups, and more incentives in order to help to move people towards those more efficient operation zones.
Thank you, everybody. I noticed we have a hand up in the participants group. I would just ask again that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will get to it at the tail end of the discussion here. Sticking with Jesse, in 2016, when Oregon was opening its adult use market, you were appointed by the governor to the Cannabis Environmental Best Practices Task Force. Can you tell us more about that, the composition, goals, outcomes of that group, and whether there's a lesson learned for the federal government there about how to proceed?
Yeah, certainly. So yes, Governor Kate Brown, understanding the position that Oregon traditionally holds in energy efficiency and environmentalism, decided it was really important to get an understanding, I think, first and foremost, of what the landscape was like for energy and water efficiency and cannabis cultivation and cannabis operations. So luckily I had a background during my time at Siemens in the energy and environmental business unit, where we went around to different industrial facilities, pulp and paper mills, manufacturing facilities, identifying opportunities to reduce energy and conserve water and reduce the carbon footprint. So I was lucky to be selected by the governor for one of the seats that was focused on cultivation. There was another cannabis cultivation seat, but the other seats were made up of legislators, other farmers from different crops, different city officials, building services, water officials within the city and within the state. And what we ultimately did was we really kind of sat down for about 2 months, I believe it was, and went through a number of different presentations to gather as much information as possible, really debated, what those potential situations could look like as it related to cannabis legalization in Oregon, and kind of wrapped our arms around it and ultimately came up with a number of recommendations. Those recommendations had a lot to do with water efficiency. They had a lot to do with data collection and education, as well as developing a certification program to help to incentivize and help to educate the consumers that are out there. So I think without a doubt, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned because, as Derek mentioned, there's so many different types of cultivation. There's so many different regulations that are affecting operations in different ways, that really having a solid group of people who understand these things and coming up with sensible regulations that will that we can measure and that we can understand if they were successful is something that every single state and I believe municipality needs to do as they understand kind of how cannabis legalization will affect these issues.
Can you talk a little bit about that certification system? Is that something that ultimately you think will be valuable to the marketplace?
Without a doubt, and I think there's differing opinions, but from my standpoint of being in a state where there is almost a saturation point, very, very highly competitive. I understand that the more consumers, the more cultivation companies and retailers understand how these causes will differentiate them, how they will help to drive more sales through customer education. I feel like certification programs are some of the best things that can be implemented, especially when there's already a lot of regulation that is being brought onto this new industry. And I think that that's something that the majority of those members understood. And a lot of our testimony came from cultivators who were struggling with the amount of regulations that they had to kind of adhere to as they were just starting their new businesses, and were very much celebrating the opportunity to utilize this as a chance to compete in the market and a chance to differentiate their brand and their business. So I think that a certification program and the Resource Innovation Institute has been kind of moving along that direction with other organizations out there is one of the things that will naturally guide people towards it, because I will invest money in something that will make me more money. And it's very difficult sometimes without enough education to convince people that 1 year payback or 2 year paybacks are the most important thing as it relates to investing in this energy efficiency. They have to understand that it moves the market in addition to reducing, or improving their bottom line. So I'm definitely a proponent of a certification program. And honestly, most of the cultivators that I speak with are dying for opportunities to differentiate out there in the market.
You might have already answered a bit of this as you explained why you think that you can drive change from the growers, but do you want to talk at all about your kind of personal journey in adopting energy efficiency within your grow, and what made you take the actions you took there, what you found to be most helpful as that grower, utility incentives, financing, just the suite of tools you've been both using and what has been the most helpful?
Sure. So essentially, the thing that drove me and makes me understand this is when I joined Siemens, was kind of the energy efficiency revolution in engineering or industrial projects. And it was driven that way, not because of the bottom line, but because General Electric had a dancing elephant in the rain on TV every time you turned on a great game. And that drove all those customers that were buying products, and those plant managers started thinking about how this can help to move their business through branding and differentiation, in addition to reducing the costs that were going crazy with energy at the time. So with myself coming in and understanding first the benefits from a dollar standpoint of reducing your operational costs was great. But then also my very great understanding that it mattered to customers. And that of course is the right thing to do. And we cannot be growing a plant that is essentially harming our environment. That's, you know, a horrible thing to be doing. So when I came in, ultimately we went about it like that. We looked for opportunities that would reduce or that would give us a payback of 3 to 6 months. And those are things that we can invest in on our own, but also things that took 6 months to a year and a half. In normal industrial areas, people would invest in it without a doubt. But within cannabis cultivation, because so many costs, because of the unsurety of the regulations, there's things that hurt the ability to invest in those longer payback projects. So we were able to work with the Oregon Energy Trust, as well as an equipment financer, to reduce the cost of that equipment. Our HVAC was developed through the Oregon Energy Trust, our lighting, as well as our dehumidification. That helped us to reduce the cost of that equipment. We were able to get that equipment financed and then get it all into our facility and be kind of a shining example of what we wanted to lead towards and as it related to cannabis cultivation. And one great thing that we did, Andrew, which was a kind of a low-hanging fruit opportunity, and there's so many areas in cultivation that are low-hanging fruit, is we rerouted all of our dehumidification condensate water, as well as our AC condensate water, to one area, filtered that, and then put it back into the system for watering the plants, and ultimately reduced our water usage sometimes between 30 up to 50% on a daily basis, which was astounding. We thought maybe we would get 5 or 10. So those are some of the things that we've done, and how my background helped me to visualize that potential of what it could do in the market, and how working with the Oregon Energy Trust, as well as equipment financiers, helped us to actually make that happen, and really ultimately help us to be one of the most efficient operations in the market.
I've been to hundreds of grows, and I can honestly say that that is some pioneering stuff right there, not only in what you achieved, but the modes of financing you went to go achieve that. So congratulations on that. That's really incredible. Switching to Brian, you've said in the past that a certification system is the missing piece in this market. Can you elucidate what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. Definitely think it's a missing long-term piece to this conversation and helping people get to a more sustainable place, right? If we look at other ways market transformation has occurred in other industries, you know, I think LEED has served as an important roadmap for operators in those markets as to what things they can implement, what actions they can take, whether it be in just regular maintenance or infrastructure in their systems to have a better environmental outcome. I think it also has served as an important education tool for the industry itself, policymakers, product manufacturers, to really look at, okay, what tools can we provide to people? How do we need to enhance them and set some goals in that process? It needs to be whole facility approach, right? I think one of the shortcomings to discussion to date is it's been laser focused in one area. And I think the certification system can be more focused on, to your point, Andrew, like you said in the beginning, there are operators of all different sizes. You're dealing with operators of all different sizes, all different sophistications, all different financial means. You know, it's great Jesse was able to get the opportunity to tap into some different programs to help him with that. But there's a lot of folks that don't have that opportunity, right? Depending on how their state operates their program. There's clearly not access to federal incentives, right? Given the current federal status of it. So this is where I think, you know, with the long-term hopeful adoption of federal legalization, it can help support systems like this as we move forward.
The second question I had queued up for you is how can a certification system be designed to accommodate these market dynamics of changing technologies and innovation, particularly in controlled and environmental agriculture? Feels like you answered a lot of that before, but anything you'd want to add within that?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes back to the data question too. First, I think we need to understand the data that's out there. We need to create a baseline. When we talked before about what the industry was like 10 years ago to what it is today, massive improvements I think have been made. However, a lot of the information is anecdotal. Organizations like RI are going out there and getting basically people to volunteer their information. So it's all dependent on what you get in and the goodwill of other people. So I think if we can actually formalize some of this, start getting accurate data as to what are operators seeing in their grows of different sizes, different shapes, that'll help us understand what operations are actually being more successful at efficiency. What do those operations look like, right? Because it's, again, going back to whole system. You change something in lighting, you need to change something in HVAC and dehumidification, you're adjusting your climate. And that will also help us identify those stories to help share with people to buy into the fact that they can make these changes and still be successful with their yields and their business. I think once we have that data and create that baseline, it will then help us chart that course to achieve those goals once we have that better understanding of the technology that's being used, how it's being used. So I go back to that. I think the certification system is going to be a great tool, but it's only going to be good as the data we have at our fingertips. And so creating that platform, I think, is going to be really important when we think about that design.
All right, so this is the question that is probably the most interesting in substance, but people's eyes often glaze over when they talk about it. When we talk about data here, what is our metric of success? And what should we be standardizing, particularly when you talk about things like certification? Is it efficiency by canopy square foot? Is it productivity of the resource use? As we start to create a national standard around things like a certification program, what do we want to be our metric of success?
Yeah, listen, there's a lot of ways to cut that. And I think it's going to take several of them to do. When we look at states that have done this and just created, like Massachusetts, they created a wattage per square foot standard, right? People then start to look at their design and, okay, how do we achieve that? But it could lead to growers creating, multiple grow rooms that don't necessarily achieve the goal of it. So I think we got to be really careful in the mandates, and like Derek said in the beginning, carrots, not sticks. So we can go back and get that data. Yes, we need to look at the energy use data and start collecting that. That's great. I think we also need to bring in an economic component, and we've been trying to look at this in different ways too. So, with all the coverage that's out there, a lot of the comparisons are to residential. But if we can go back and look at economic output too and bring that into the equation, we've been starting to look at, okay, in licensed operations, cannabis that's consumed, if you look at dollars of GDP generated for energy use, cannabis actually comes out better than most manufacturing operations that are out there from an industry perspective. And again, that's something that I think gets overlooked. But again, we're looking at anecdotal data, so we got to get good data for that. But I'd say it's taking, a mix of straight energy use, breaking it down by systems, bringing in the economic aspects of it as well to help people get there.
Any other thoughts from the panel on metrics? I know that this is the place to wonk out, so I want to give you your time if anybody else wants to weigh in on metrics.
Sure, I'll jump in just to say, I think there probably isn't just one metric, right? We need a series of metrics, and that's certainly the way we look at performance in other types of buildings, other types of manufacturing operations, and even in developing certifications. It's usually a whole host of metrics to help you address the different outputs that or outcomes that you're hoping for, whether they be economic outcomes, climate outcomes, water efficiency, all of this comes together. And I think we really need to think through, what's the right suite of metrics that we want to put together. to judge performance.
Well, I hope RII does that.
Thanks. We're working on it. I would love to add, there's a comment that addressed greenhouse gases and different levels of impact of different types of production. And I agree with a lot of those comments. And I just want to build on this notion of which performance metrics are key, right? And I think to some degree, they're going to matter in different regions differently. Water shortages in one area, may suggest that whatever's most water efficient would be maybe the most appropriate there. We are seeing that indoor production seems to be more water efficient than outdoor, but of course, outdoor could be super water efficient. Just depends on the application of the cultivator, best practices, the climate that they're in, when they're watering, etc. So that's just one example. And the other example is energy use, is often thought of as a straight line to carbon emissions, but that's not always the case in certain markets where the grid is cleaner, like in California. And so we have to really, to Jen's point, think about different metrics and what really matters to various market actors, and make decisions based on that. Yeah.
And to that, one of the questions being asked, and we will get to all of these questions. I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for them because they're coming in fast and furious and they're really great. But this happens to fit in this part of this conversation. When you talk about national standards, whatever it is, whatever metrics we end up to adopt, are we intending that to be adopted by a federal agency and be mandatory, or be an industry voluntary consensus standard? What's your guys' vision here?
I mean, what we're referring to in when we say focusing on carrots, not sticks, and encouraging a certification system is a voluntary system that would pair with other regulatory approaches that are happening at the state level. I think to Brian's point, that is missing in the market. And we see in many markets that voluntary leadership recognition programs can actually drive faster adoption of efficiency than a heavy-handed approach, because it can tie to the flywheel of the organization and earn more revenue, to Jesse's point. Yeah.
Jennifer, I want to get to you before we turn to question and answers. What is the typical role the federal government plays when emerging energy-intensive industries arrive in the market?
So, I think one of the things that's interesting is, this is a rare case where we sort of have an inclination or an understanding of what the impact, the energy impact of a new industry can be, right? Usually it's a very reactive thing, and something that, at least, and I know, certainly from my role at ACEEE, and one of the reasons I started working in this area was, we could see it coming. We knew, this was going to be a growing industry, and that was very energy intensive. So, I think it's a little bit unusual that we're in a position to sort of, go out and think about what kind of policies might make sense and how we can support resource efficiency in this industry as legalization happens. So it's a little bit of a new frontier, but I think there's a lot that we've learned, from other industries and other buildings sectors in particular, that we can bring to bear to make sure that that the federal role in this industry takes advantage of all of those best practices.
I'm going to give you the most leading question I have today, which is, why is it so important to have a trusted central source for data aggregation and objective analysis and reporting?
All right. Well, there are so many sayings, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. We've just had a conversation about metrics, and that could be the subject of multiple webinars alone. But I think we all know that there has been a lot of information out there about energy consumption in the cannabis industry that really has, when you read the methodology, you realize that it was really pulled out of air, and really trying to put it together because there just wasn't data available. And we see across the board that having that access to data is super important. For many, many years in the buildings industry, in the building space, there was, folks were going around and trying to do efficiency projects, but there were no benchmarks. There was no way for a building owner to know if they were doing well or if they were doing, poorly. Did they have a competitive edge over their competition because they were efficient, or were they really wasting money? And was that part of what was hitting their bottom line because they weren't paying attention to their energy consumption? And so the experience of something like Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is used to benchmark buildings, the stories there have shown that just providing access to these tools and providing information to owners and building managers over time, that they continuously improve their performance once they see where the opportunities lie, that this data can help them understand where they could do better, and that by benchmarking their performance against others, they can see, where they fall and what type of headroom they might have to move their performance forward.
You just answered this in part, but what role do you envision the federal government can play in shaping and advancing a market-based mechanism like a certification system?
Sure. So, there's so much work that can be done, and there's so many opportunities for the federal government to help. As I mentioned before, I think resources for research and development of new technologies, research to support growers and the manufacturers that are serving them with equipment and so forth. Right now, through federally funded research at universities, at the national labs, to the USDA, there's a lot of testing going on, and that can eliminate the barrier. As Jesse was talking about, if your if your bottom line is reliant on getting your yield with every profit you grow, you're not going to go in there and mess with your recipe. You don't know what's going to happen. But if you can go to another facility that can do that testing for you, that can try that stuff out, and can provide, get that data and show you what's working and what's not, then you don't have to risk your own livelihood, your own, bottom line, that yield, doing that. So I think that's a really big part of what the federal government can do, right? Do that sort of research, provide technical assistance directly to the industry, but also to states and cities on policy. What types of policies make sense. Massachusetts, for instance, does have a requirement that the growers report on the energy use in their cultivation facilities. Similarly, the benchmarking tool that the federal government uses, Energy Star, the portfolio manager, is being used by states and cities that are doing buildings benchmarking to kind of make clear and require disclosure of that information. It doesn't require any upgrades be made, but it does require that data be transparent to the market. And that's a really important part of what can be done. And then I think also just offering support for the type of recognition programs to showcase those that are doing a great job and help them use that as a tool to better market their businesses.
This has been an awesome conversation, but we have some really, really great questions here that I'd love to dive into. And I'm almost nervous that we're not going to get to all of them. So the only fair way I have to do this is to go through them in the order with which they came in. And this is for everyone unless kind of explicitly called out. So the first one is, how can we expect the government to incentivize innovation in the industry when the perception of the commodity, cannabis, is not seen as a societal good necessarily? In contrast to federal incentivization of innovation in building, which can be more easily appreciated by lawmakers and regulators, as buildings and efficiency in the sectors are perceived as goods for society.
I think that perception, I understand that, but the tax dollars are coming in, the budgets are being filled with cannabis dollars. Jobs are being created all the time. Legislators have people in, their constituents are speaking in so many ways. So I don't necessarily think that a support for an incentive program is necessarily support for cannabis or support for marijuana. I think it's support for environmental efficiency, support for carbon reduction, support for the health of the citizens now that we're bringing in this new market. So I think reframing it and making sure that it's focused on those conversations are focused there. And I know that legislators are looking there. I think they are looking past maybe some of the general taboo views of cannabis legalization. I think there's an easy argument for them to jump on board.
It's almost like cannabis reform is here and it's now our job to get it right. So, which is the tagline for CPEAR. The focus of the discussion thus far has really been on lighting, but one of the findings of recent research by Summers et al. Was that the biggest source of GHG emissions was systems to maintain temperature and humidity levels. I'd be interested to hear panelists' views on how we address this source of GHG emissions.
Jesse's got a
Brian,
go for it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Derek. Yeah, listen, this is why I'm saying this has to be a holistic conversation, right? Whether it be indoor or outdoor cultivation, there are positives and negatives to it. There are ways that those operations can be more efficient. You go beyond cultivation. It's actually, let's use I think a phrase that has become famous in cannabis legalization, seed to sale, right? Each step of the operation is going to have an impact sustainability wise. And I see there's another question on packaging as well. This is the exact type of conversation we need to have and start setting holistic goals on how these things all integrate. But yes, there are ways to do that. I think the specifics of it are going to come down to how the facility is built out and what type of equipment they're using. There's different types of dehumidification and HVAC systems that, depending on the system. And again, going back to the fact that people have different means to fund their operations, that's going to dictate kind of how their operation is coming together. And so, I think an important part of this is also going to be technical services going forward, right? And having a team that can not only sell equipment, but then guide the operator in how those systems have to come together and how to maintain them over time. So those are just some thoughts, I think, on HVAC and dehumidification. I think if that person's looking for kind of specific recommendations, we can follow on offline afterwards.
Derek, this is specific towards you at the tail end that you mentioned that no one kind of cultivation is more environmentally sustainable. And this person agrees that the methods of cultivation and geographic differences are important variables. However, generally speaking, would you agree that organic outdoor grows have a significantly lower impact on GHG emissions than indoor grows?
Certainly energy use. And again, if there's a direct line, there's not necessarily a direct line from energy use to carbon emissions. So, but yeah, I think generally, if you're looking at the metric of carbon emissions, yes, outdoor field farming is generally going to have less impact, but we also have to recognize that just because it's outdoor does not mean it's sustainable. The agricultural industry is one of the major contributors to climate change for a variety of reasons. And there's other impacts with outdoor. So I think it's really, what I was trying to get across is that it's not accurate to make a blanket statement that one form of production, generally, no matter where it's done or how it's done, is more environmentally preferable. I wasn't trying to make that statement related to greenhouse gas emissions. Again, policymakers have to think about different issues. Climate change is obviously critical for everyone, but some jurisdictions may be more focused on water, maybe focused on different issues, right? And so it's important to help them make effective decisions broadly.
Does anyone know of good metrics to measure cannabis waste, namely metrics that demonstrate the benefits of a switch to biodegradable packaging? I think this is partly goes to former answers by Brian, but benefits of switching to a biodegradable form of packaging over traditional packaging. the commenter goes on to say, if we aren't judging performance by the mounds of waste companies leave in their wake, we are not judging performance right. Or what about metrics around cannabis waste recycling, like vape take back programs?
I mean, we're beginning to measure waste as well at both plant waste, which frankly is mostly driven by regulation because the industry is not allowed to, in many cases, compost because of fear of public safety. You know, so and as well as non-plant waste. And so we have to think about these metrics based on productivity and efficiency of resources, right? So usually you want to divide it by the amount of product that's being produced. As far as, you know, recycling of vape cartridges in particular, we'd have to think about the recycling rates versus the usage as an example.
Any other thoughts here?
You know, I think in general, tracking that waste, I think that's another place where data, I think that's maybe a little bit more difficult to track the amount of waste that each production facility is generating. But certainly, I think there can be some easy metrics that you can develop to understand that. I think that packaging is a really important thing. I think most of the country is moving more towards, I don't know the term for it, but where, right, you bring your container and they fill it up and then you take it back home. So, you know, like this beer growler type of approach that, you know, a lot of different industries are moving toward, that the cannabis industry is really set up very, very well to take on without really any, without any disruption. So I certainly think that's a major area, but also overregulation, to Derek's point, in plant tagging. The requirement to tag each and every plant with a non-recyclable piece of plastic each and every harvest is just not really sensible, and is definitely not environmentally friendly. So I know that there are some of these regulating organizations like Metric that are looking for solutions to that. But without a doubt, overregulation, I think, and fear of cannabis getting out to other, many of the bad regulations are based on fear. As we move forward, understandably so, we're regulating an illegal substance or a formerly illegal substance. So, for example, there was a push in Oregon to remove, because there's so many pieces of plastic that you have to have on things to make it child resistant. People were trying to remove the requirement for child resistant packaging or flour, understanding that, if a child is small enough, then they don't know how to roll up a joint, and smoke it, or they can't light a lighter for this level of packaging. And, you can't eat cannabis and get high without decarboxylating it. So it's a very simple, movement that would help to reduce the amount of waste that was shot down immediately once it was brought to the legislature. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there, which then goes to, education and data.
Hey, I'll just add from a different perspective too. So we're not at that end of the supply chain that you're talking about, packaging waste, but we sell products that involve packaging. So just some food for thought as we think about this issue is, one, a technology perspective. So just because we want a certain type of packaging or a certain type of outcome doesn't mean the technology is there yet. It may still need to be refined. And Jesse brings up a great point about like childproof packaging. I'm not even sure if there's biodegradable childproof packaging. If there is, great, but I think there's got to be more of a dialogue too among the product manufacturers there to be brought to the table, so that policymakers and I think this is the point of the supply chain, it would be dispensary owners, right, would be having a dialogue together about, okay, where's the technology today? Where do you think it can be in 5 and 10 years? And lay out that roadmap of how do we get to that sustainability goal. I think there's a lot of times where people have a knee-jerk reaction. We need to get there, things get put in place, and then manufacturers at the end of the day are scrambling to try and catch up. And I've seen that in packaging in other parts of my career here, where we had packaging, we had products that had to be outside and exposed to the elements, but biodegradable packaging wouldn't work in that type of environment. So it was holding up our ability to adopt more sustainable practices, but we weren't in control of it because we don't create that product. So I think we got to be careful to make sure we have all stakeholders at the table in that to make sure that we're able to achieve those goals.
I'm going to end with an intriguing question that has been posted here, but before I do, because that'll take us to time, as a wrap up, I want to thank you all first. I'll give you a second to have both closing thoughts and an answer to this question. But a special thank you to Derek Smith, Jen Amon, Jesse Horton, and Brian Harrington. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. I think this has been amazing. Further questions about today's discussion, I truly encourage you to visit cpear.org or resourceinnovation.org. There's ways to contact both of us through those. And again, thank you for everything. As a closing question, and maybe also just throw in your closing conclusions, how much of the cannabis energy use is believed to be new load versus load shifted from the illicit markets to the regulated market?
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts. I think it really depends on where you're talking about, right? So I think it's a bigger issue clearly in California and maybe some of the Western states where there's been more of a long-term illicit market. Other places where a lot of that illicit growing is going on indoors, I think moving it into a professionalized facility is really going to, be a more efficient process overall. But I think, some of the research we've seen in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, it doesn't indicate that there's that much of a load shift. I think in California, it'll really depend on, when there is a drop off in the illicit market, which we know is still going strong there.
Jesse, I saw you were trying to get in there.
Yeah, I think Jim brings up a good point in that, of course, in a place like Florida, the amount of load, right, is probably 98% new facilities, right, and not really much illicit or illegal happening there over those years. And, in places like Oregon and California, it will be less, but I still think it's pretty high. I think that a lot of the production facilities have replaced cannabis that had been coming from other countries into the U.S. and now that's just kind of frozen. Everything's being produced here. So I think it's probably a high percentage depending on the area. But certainly I would say in Oregon, where there have traditionally been a lot of cultivators, this is just a guess. It's not based on any, thumb in the wind, any data. I would say that at least there's 60% that is new facilities versus what has been traditional.
And this goes back to, the statistic I threw out there in the beginning, just looking at how much is being sold in the legal market today, and that transition from illicit to legal, as that consumer comes over, as that grower comes over and shifts, is going to have a positive impact just to creating a modern facility alone. And that's going to have dramatic impacts, not only on energy, which I think a lot of the conversation was focused on, but water, air, soil impacts as well. So these are some of the key reasons why we think, indoor growing is going to remain a part of the marketplace for the future. I think it's part of the reason we think that you have to look at cultivation, manufacturing, dispensaries, delivery holistically, and look at those sustainability impacts to what Derek said of, let's not just focus on one area of the industry. All parts of the industry can be more sustainable. And so as a product manufacturer, Hawthorne's going to be a leader with that. We're going to partner with folks as we can, as federal legalization allows. Can't wait. Our company can't wait for the day federal legalization comes and we can actually do R&D in the US on a cannabis plant. Right now, we're doing that up in Kelowna, Canada, where we spent millions of dollars up there. So continuing to have this dialogue and continuing to integrate the discussions from this conversation into those future actions is really going to be beneficial. So thanks to everybody for having us today. Hopefully that was helpful.
I'll just
Great.
throw in
Derek,
a
last word.
really quick closing comment. So I think the more cannabis becomes regulated, accepted, the more the illicit market moves to the regulated market. It's, cannabis is basically at that point being accepted into the agricultural world. And I think there's so much to learn from the traditional ag world. We need regenerative soil practices. We need outdoor cultivation. We need to rebuild our soils. We also need to look at the growing greenhouse movement, the indoor movement, and understand the opportunities there to protect genetics from climate change, to have backup, food systems when supply chains fall apart. And so that's the world we're heading into, is that we need all the above, and we need all of the above to be efficient and sustainable.
Well, we thank you all for being the people who are going to help us get there. Please, everybody, this conversation is only as good as the follow-up from it. We exist as organizations to directly lobby for change at the federal level. And so please stay engaged with us about where this should go and how we should get there. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you.